Thank you all for joining. I'm Geoff Ruxton. I'm the Head of Business Development at Immense. I'm delighted to host today's session titled Embracing On-Demand Mobility, How Do We Effectively Enable Flexible Transportation Services? I'm really lucky to be joined by three excellent panelists. So firstly, we've got Philippe Crist. So Philippe is an advisor for innovation and foresight for the International Transport Forum at the OECD. He focuses on disruptive urban mobility scenarios and examines their implications for car-based and active mobility, public transport, and urban space and vitality. He leads ITF's work on data science and investigates how policy and regulation might adapt to an increasingly algorithmically driven world. So thank you, Philippe, for joining. We've also got Mike Waters. So Mike is Director of Policy, Strategy and Innovation at Transport for the West Midlands. He developed the regional UK Pathfinder Future Mobility Zone, sponsors the West Midlands 5G Mobility Programme and also the Transport Innovation Programmes. He sits on the Midlands Future Mobility Boards, Zenzic's UK CAM Hub Steering and Advisory Boards, and also the Smart Transport Editorial Board. Mike's also embedded in Coventry University's Future Transport and Cities Research Institute as a researcher focused on privacy concerns in connected and autonomous vehicles. So thank you for joining as well, Mike. And finally, we have Tim Papandreou. Tim's the founder of Emerging Transport Advisors, a global advisory firm preparing companies, startups, investors and governments to seize the shared electric, connected and automated mobility transition. He was previously Chief Innovation Officer and Head of Strategic Planning for San Francisco's Transportation Agency before leading strategic partnerships both at Google X and Waymo, working with teams to commercialize and launch the world's first fully self-driving technology, which has been applied to ride-hailing, logistics and deliveries as well. So on behalf of all the attendees and myself, thank you, the three of you, for joining. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. A couple of practicalities before we kick off. The session should be about 45 minutes today. We'll start with the panel discussion and then about 10 minutes before the end, we'll give time for questions and answers from the audience. You should be able to see the chat box at the bottom. If you have any questions as we go along, please pop them in there and we'll come to them at the end. So without further ado, it's great firstly to have such a distinguished panel. And I guess the starting question can benefit our audience quite a lot with the broad spectrum of opinions and experiences that you have. So the starting question to the panelists is, what do you think are the mega trends in the provision of safe, efficient and environmentally friendly transportation services? I wondered, Philippe, whether you want to kick off with your global perspective.
The megatrends today are in fact not the ones that we might have initially thought of even just a year ago. I think clearly we have to start with the sanitary situation in which we are. So the impact of COVID-19 on top of all these other trends that were already underway. Those trends include urbanization. It includes a shift of population growth or a continued shift of population growth to developing countries. It also concerns the improved safety record of transport, but only in some of our countries, and a diminishment of our transport safety record in a lot of other countries, and for specific populations. So while transport has become safer for those inside vehicles, it's become less safe for those outside of vehicles and in cities. And this is something that we have to keep in mind, not just in the developing world, but in our countries as well. And finally, urbanization, and that's clearly a driver. I think one of the things that we'll see going forward is a re-urbanization or a different pattern of urbanization that might emerge both from the COVID-19 pandemic and our reaction to it, our different experience of urban spaces after that, but as well in response to some of the major environmental challenges that we face, climate change being the first and foremost of these. However, I don't think that, at least on that last note, the climate change challenge, emergency, if you will, as important as it is something that will drive local policy. I'd be very interested to hear from Mike, or even commercial policy. Really interested to hear from Tim, because it is a bit abstract. I mean, we know and can feel some of the immediate impacts, but in terms of our everyday life and everyday policy making, it's not something that we think of first. And so I think there's some real synergies to find in terms of different forms of pollution, traditional pollution, the ways in which, as I said, we can deliver better safety, noise safety, the lived experience of being in a city. All of these can react in a way to improve our climate outcomes without necessarily being targeted directly at climate change. So I think largely all the challenges that we had before are still there. I think this added layer of COVID-19 is going to change the part of the trajectory, but we're still dealing with the same challenges. And of course, the final one is the interlinkages of all these different technologies and services that we have available through digital technology, which is a real accelerant, if you will, for some types of changes. So that's largely what we see going forward.
Thanks, Philippe. Yeah, I'm picking up on some of those trends. Tim, I wonder whether you're recognizing similar things. I guess the climate change issue connects into a lot of different angles, maybe shared mobility and the benefits it could have for climate change or electrification of services. So yeah, are you seeing similar trends, or is there anything from a technology perspective you might like to add?
Yeah, I think Philippe has given us a good broad overview of the global trend. That's his role, so he's really good at doing those big broad overviews. I'll zoom in a little bit more on some of the things that we're seeing worldwide as well, that I think are more cultural as well as technological. So the world's transport industry has basically agreed that electrification is moving forward. It's unstoppable. Everything that has wheels will be eventually electrified. That's just basically all the investments going in there. We're raising literally almost $1 trillion of capital into that space. I feel sorry for the EV companies of 15 years ago, because now that all get funded in a second. So all that's moving forward, which is great. And we're seeing not just for passenger vehicles, but for commercial logistics, delivery, all that's basically moving forward for electrification. And there's a lot of urbanist Twitter chit chat about, is this good or bad? It's really important, but it's not the ultimate thing, obviously. But that's what industry can do. Industry can invest and move forward on the technology side, but the policy part squarely sits with government, and that's on behavior change. That's on all the pieces of linking all these pieces together to be able to move around without a passenger vehicle. All of those things are really squarely in the hands of government. And frankly, that's our weakest link right now in terms of, and COVID basically really underscored and lit a light on how vulnerable that system is. So we're seeing more digitization, more of the manual processes. A lot of city governments that I've worked with, they couldn't do the road changes that people want to see because the servers weren't connected. They couldn't actually access their GIS files remotely. They had to come into the office, which wasn't allowed. So all of those vulnerabilities now have been really squarely understood, that we need to basically stitch all that stuff together. So we're going to be in a period of stitching all of these manual pieces while the industry electrifies. And then the automation piece we can talk about later, but that's going to be basically on top. What's interesting on the logistics side is that the driver is not electrification or automation, it's e-commerce. E-commerce is driving all this change really quickly. And electrification on one hand is like the known entity that can improve efficiency, and automation is the hope that it'll actually keep that efficiency going. But there's an understanding that the two are synergistic. So we're going to see a lot of that play out over this next decade. And you know, the work from home reality was not the case for a lot of people. And what's making me, I guess, concerned is that we're seeing a duality in our world, in our society, where there's those who have the luxury, actually all of us on this panel and most of the audience probably, who can afford to work from home, who can live at home and actually rely on all these essential services brought to them via e-commerce and everything else and bandwidth. And then there's those who can't. And they either have to be exposed to these environments and have not had a day off since lockdown in March. They've worked nonstop, or they've been basically locked out of the economy because their place of business is no longer available. So we're seeing these dualities that I'm really concerned about how we're going to address this in the future. And the equity issue is, front and center to all of this. So COVID has basically, once again, shone a light on the things that Philippe said were existing, but kind of made them acute, and we have to deal with them. We can't move forward without dealing with them.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, there's a point that you mentioned about local government and the way policies or interventions are may be made. So I wondered, Mike, I've seen a lot of the projects and programs that you got in the West Midlands, and presumably a lot of those global trends you're seeing more locally. So I wonder whether you'd like to add and give a bit of the local perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, completely agree with everything Philippe and Tim have outlined, so I won't repeat some of it. It's probably worth highlighting, I suppose, from the perspective of the UK Transport Authority. The UK does do some things slightly differently in terms of the regulatory framework, particularly outside of London. We tend to work in what we call a deregulated environment, where a lot of the transport system is operated purely commercially. I think it's worth touching on the, because you asked mega trends, or in my mind, mega pressures. Actually, COVID is placing some very significant pressures on public transport operators. We are an operator ourselves, but also our partner, your commercial organisations, and I think that's a huge thing now for most municipalities, whatever their regulatory framework, to face over the next 12 months. We are staring a bit of a cliff edge moment for conventional mass transit provision, in terms of the commerciality of that and the affordability of it. I sort of absolutely second what Tim said around e-commerce, in terms of the trends that as a trend, a consumer trend, is driving a huge amount of light goods vehicle mileage, and that is both concerning and an opportunity that's ripe for really innovative service and product offerings. I think the car-free household and car-free trend that we're tending to see, particularly in the young under 30s, is interesting. You tend to think of that perhaps naturally as a new thing, but we've got evidence, showing certainly in the West Midlands, here in the centre of the UK, that's a trend that's actually started back in about 1994. It's not actually that new, and I think there's some interesting questions about whether that's a question of deliberate choice or lack of affordability or different consumer things, and whether the car will come back on stream through the generations as perhaps still is harboured as an aspirational freedom, which people are just making different consumer choices around. So I think that's a mega trend, but to watch closely. I think positively, there's just a general trend towards as a service and service level based design, which is creeping into all aspects of consumerism, which I think if appropriately captured by a regulatory and city environment, could be really positive, but will absolutely be disruptive.
And I think I fall into the category of not owning a car and rely on maybe car sharing services or other forms of on-demand transport. So I guess focusing more on on-demand services, and maybe Philippe, you could kick us off with some of the more traditional services like buses or fixed route services, and some of the rise in on-demand services that we've seen, maybe even plugging some of the gaps in public transport service, particularly in recent times. Do you see these as competitive to one another, or complementary, or supplementary? How do you see these bits working together?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that we can say with some certainty is that it really is context dependent. It depends where, for whom, in what country, and in what urban environment. What does the rest of the city look like, and how does it function, on whether or not these work together or work against each other, cannibalize each other. what I think we can see as well is that generally, when we've reviewed a lot of studies of, there aren't that many studies, but a lot of the studies that are looking at this complementarity or competition effect, is that the first, for at least ride sourcing and the car-based forms of shared mobility, taxis are the ones that have taken the biggest hit. And to a surprising degree, public transport in many instances outside of North America. And that's because public transport in these city environments where most of the vehicle kilometers traveled by these kind of ride sourcing services takes place are also well served by public transport. And so there is an immediate shaving, if you will, of some of the lower, those public transport trips that aren't exactly fit to people's purposes or desires at that moment that we see. In North America, where there's relatively less, except out of sort of large metros, less public transport, then of course there is this car replacement. Interestingly, in China, we see an increase in people's mobility through ride sourcing, through taxi-based ride sourcing principally, but an increase of access to public transport as well, because the cost, those populations are very much more cost sensitive. When we look at the ability for ride sourcing services to link to public transport, the evidence is not as strong in Europe or North America. What we do see is that ride sourcing, again, car-based or van-based ride sourcing, enables people to live without a car. And so people who use ride sourcing services a lot or van sources a lot, they tend to use public transport as well a lot because they're much more multimodal. And that brings into this last question that I think we have to keep in the forefront of our mind, which is there's a lot of self-selection going on in these populations. So people who are living in urban areas who use a lot of ride sourcing services, well, they've chosen to live in areas where it makes sense and where they can also have access to public transport. Now, that doesn't mean that if these kind of services scale up and out of those dense city centers, that you'll see the same effects. And so to finish, I think we don't really know what the ultimate effect is at a scaled up adoption of it. We don't have to worry about that right now. We will have to worry about it soon. We don't have to worry about it right now because these trips only represent a very marginally small number of overall trips. Most of the trips are taken by walking, by public transport, and in many urban contexts by car as well.
Thanks, Philippe. And I know, Mike, there's a lot of initiatives in TFWM, in the future transport zone, maybe looking at demand responsive transit or other services that could complement public transport in your region. I wondered whether you could touch on maybe what you see are the enablers for these services or the blockers, and how you see the two bits integrating or not integrating perhaps in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, we're running out sort of fairly decent sized pilots around DRT. We're rolling out mobility credits. We've had a few forays into the world of what mobility as a service looks like, both with private sector partners, and we're about to kind of commission a new front end environment. I think one of the blockers, it's always easier to focus on the blockers, isn't it, in this space, is actually, it's a fairly, the beast that is conventional public transport is not necessarily one that's that up for innovation and disruption. You know, it's a margin thin business, and it's risk adverse because it's worried about that margin. And even if that is something that the municipality is then prepared to fund, they've still got to be prepared to fund quite a large risk. You know, the margins are small, but the overall numbers are big. So I think there's a little bit of everybody looking at everybody else to try and work out just what does success actually look like, because I don't really want to be in the vanguard. I want to be a close follower. And yeah, I suffer that dilemma. So we've been fortunate enough to secure quite a lot of the UK government's sort of funding support into this, and are on the Pathfinder sort of program for the UK. Without that, I think it would be in a very different position. You know, we've been afforded the luxury of being able to take some risks, and to do that in partnership with some quite engaged private sector operators. That partnership is probably the single biggest enabler. You know, this is something that's quite hard to force into a system. You need a coalition of the willing as well, and that requires people to understand how they can mutually benefit from each other's success. That again is not a sentiment that is as universal as I might have hoped in the commercial sector. So.
Tim, I imagine you're often sitting on different sides of the fence, kind of advising some of the tech and innovative organizations coming into authorities, as well as the authorities themselves. So I guess on-demand services, and particularly demand responsive transit, what are you seeing from the perspective of both sides?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think both Philippe and Mike have really touched on, I think, the essential pieces. We need to step back a little bit with this, and this is what I advise, and this is the uncomfortable conversation that needs to be had, is that if we don't have a full cost accounting of our transport system, which includes our land use, and really price in the cost to move a person from A to B or a thing to A to B on time, location, and emissions produced, or whatever the impact is, everybody is failing. Public transport fails, on-demand services fail, AVs will fail, everything fails, because there's no platform that there's no rules. You know, it's everything, anything goes. And I've met many mayors who said to me, like, you know, why is there so much traffic in my city? And I'm like, because your platform, which you own, are your streets, and it's a free-for-all. So unless you contain that and make very clear rules of engagement on how you participate, you're going to see everything fail. Like, why did micromobility come in and left 6 months later? Because it wasn't viable, not because of their business model. Sure, we can work on the business model, because there was just no clear, there were no bike lanes, there were no parking requirement, you know, all that sort of stuff. So if we don't have those policy structures up front to say, this is how we expect people and things to be moved in a safe, affordable, efficient, and equitable way, then everything's always going to fail, or need more subsidy, or ask for a handout, whatever you want to call it. And so we're always going to be in that situation. And public transport's in that tug of war. You know, if it carries too many people and overcrowded, it's a bad system, right? If there's not enough people right now with COVID, it's a bad system. We should dismantle it. How about we switch the discussion to, how's our transport system doing? How's everybody moving around? What's the right way for everybody to move around based on their needs on that day? And can we create a system where you don't have to use your own car for every trip or buy one, right? And if we can do that, then how we get around is frankly less relevant. It's more about, is the system working for everybody? And then the other piece of that is that maybe the metrics are wrong. You know, we are so obsessed with transit ridership numbers. That is no longer relevant. It's, are people accessing opportunities? Are people able to access their jobs? Can they keep their jobs? Can transit get them there? You know, if we have this work from home thing and this hybridized office environment, which all of my real estate tweets are talking about, we're not going to have the volumes of intensity that we had last 2 years ago in the next couple of years. And yeah, we'll get our vaccines up and we'll get back there, but that's actually kind of splitting. And so even if we had, you know, in San Francisco, the economic development team said that we're going to have a 20% reduction in foot traffic in the central business district for the foreseeable future. That's really impactful for the transit system and the highway system. So there's a good and a bad in all of this. So I think we need to step back a little bit and say, well, how do we want this new reality to form? And, you know, we will eventually go back to some sort of things that we knew in 2019, but not everything's coming back. So, and transit was struggling even with the peak numbers they had before. And those aren't necessarily all coming back. So we do need to shift the conversation away from that, I think.
If I can add something, because I think—
Jump in, Philippe, yeah.
Before in other fora, but I mean, the situation that we had before COVID was a situation that was created by design. We designed our cities to make it easy to get around by car and somewhat easy to get around by public transport. And the fact is, going back to your question, are these ride source or these shared services complementary to public transport? They weren't designed to be. Our cities aren't designed to deliver that. And so we have this moment now where we can think about, well, how then should we design our cities and the legislative and regulatory framework around our cities to encourage that complementarity? It's a choice that we have, and it's a choice that public authorities have at this moment, uniquely because we have this pause after which we can start rethinking the way in which we coordinate services, design the built environment, and go forward with another plan that supports something that we know is more efficient, less environmentally impactful, and more safe.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Philippe's saying, a lot of the I call it the Twitter transpo zeitgeist, right? A lot of the conversation is like, well, Uber's bad, Didi's bad, Grab's bad, micromobility is bad. They're acting in the way they're allowed to act.
Yeah, exactly.
If we change the rules of the system, they will act accordingly because their job is to constantly optimize and get access to their bottom line. So if we put in a fee, an access fee, a price fee for everybody, not just for the Ubers, but for everybody, and decide what that is like, the system will figure itself out. I think that's where we're missing the conversation. It's like, well, why can't this solution work? Because the infrastructure platform around us is allowed to be a free-for-all. Yeah. I think we need to change that. We need dedicated bike lanes, dedicated transit lanes, dedicated pickup and drop-off zones for these vehicles, an access fee, a pickup and drop-off fee. Without those things in place, these things will struggle and will continually go in the wrong direction.
I mean, running riot on Geoff's ability to chair this agenda, but I agree with absolutely all of that. As a transport planner, there is a harsh reality in this of, as much as the fiscal policy tools are absolutely required, there is a hearts and minds piece with the general public around the acceptability of that. And in terms of solving this problem requires a massive retrofit to an urban fabric, a legacy of urban fabric of decades, which again requires a massive hearts and minds campaign. This is easy to solve if you're on a new build town or a new build city and you can start with a blank sheet of paper, but we're dealing with hundreds of years of suburban sprawl and legacy here, most of which has developed on the basis of a private car. And actually to re-engineer that requires a level of acceptance from those residents. And I think that maturity of dialogue, that hearts and minds piece to support then a viable Mars and DRT and so on, is the centerpiece problem. That's the mission.
I think there's a wedge that's coming in right now, and that stems from the relocalization of travel around home places and more localized travel, because then that provides certain types of densities for that type of travel and different options that weren't available before. And although that's certainly not the case everywhere, but I can see that in town centers outside of the big cities, and I can see that in suburbs around even strip malls in North America, where the need to move locally and the need for a lot of people to move locally creates new opportunities to think about, well, how might you deliver transport services differently in these areas? But Mike, you're absolutely right. The lock-in isn't just a physical lock-in. It's not just a technical lock-in. It is a lock-in of hearts and minds. The only thing I can say is when the car arrived on the scene, it also faced an insurmountable task, and to change the entire fabric of the economy. And by God, with the public authorities' help, we built those roads and we made it happen. So let's think of what that might be.
Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. It was the vision. When they said there was no vision back then, the Interstate Highway Act in the US was a clear vision. We want this, and we did it. So if we want to change it, we have to do it and make it happen. I think also it's important to note that people are now self-selecting. They're the ones who have resources and the ones that can, because the internet-based bandwidth is getting good enough across the world where you can literally locate to where you want to be to. And so we've seen some stories where, oh, everyone's leaving cities and it's going to be terrible, blah, blah, blah. Well, those people wanted to leave anyway, and now they've found a reason to leave, and they can live in the suburbs or go further out. But guess what's happening in the suburbs? The suburbs are actually becoming more of these neighborhood centers. people want more of the services now in their local environments. And so we're now have a question of how do we make the downtowns, the CBDs, more like community neighborhoods, because they're missing all those layers, because they're only designed to basically support the intensification of people congregating very closely, supported by, you know, heavy duty, high volume public transport. But if that model is a little questionable, then the suburban, lower tier density places with more neighborhood services sprinkled across more places might actually be the more sustainable model, even though it sounds counterintuitive right now. It just can't be car-based. It needs to be multimodal. And I think, again, infrastructure, dedicated lanes, the services, all that is what is on the government side. The tech stuff is there. It just needs the permission or the access to basically serve it.
And I guess combining a couple of questions that we had together, and I think particularly focused maybe at Mike, so to be able to make decisions about these transport services, it's important to have data and to be able to use that for data-driven decision making. So I just wanted to ask, and maybe Philippe and Tim, you can come in after as well, in terms of the use of data or modeling or simulation tools, what do you see their part is in terms of planning the on-demand services of tomorrow, or maybe working out where they might better serve these different communities?
As there's two sort of lumps, isn't there, in that question? I think we all recognise that data sharing is absolutely critical for this to work. There's lots of actors in this ecosystem, and you can only do effective planning of a more flexible, demand responsive transport system if all those actors are prepared to share data. And I think we probably all understand the fairly well-rehearsed concerns around kind of data processing techniques and all of that. Quite often it's easy to extend beyond the scope for which the data was shared by the user in the first place. And that's a concern. I think I'd probably observe in this space that the largely tech and engineer driven bit of the solutions development is probably not wrongly focused on cybersecurity, but focused on cybersecurity to the exclusion of some of the privacy issues and implications of this. And I think the privacy bit extends way beyond just mere data processing to other aspects around surveillance, autonomy of decision making as opposed to autonomy of the technology. And there's quite a lot in there which is a longer conversation, but gets to the heart of the two-tier society problem that Tim was alluding to, where people with affluence are left with choices to decide what to opt into and what not to, and people without that affluence are kind of left to be routed wherever the system demands to share with people that they might not choose to share with, to receive infotainment along the route which they might not wish to receive, which are all aspects of privacy. So we've been working on a framework for that. I think your point on the modelling for me is sort of classic, and clearly Immense are hosting this. We've been investing a lot with pulling in data from some of these actors in this ecosystem, aggregated wherever we can. On the whole, my objective is not to hold any PPI unless I absolutely need to. But the models, I think, provide a really good way to aggregate all of these different data feeds, to take the apples, oranges and pears, turn them into fruit, and importantly, infill, not just sort of spatially where we don't have gaps, but temporally, in terms of then if I can consume as a service and transport operator a synthetic view of the world which is sufficiently accurate, then it actually gets around some of the concerns around the data privacy and the data sharing. So I think it's an unexploited area of the transport planning business and sector to take these different data sets and then use transport planner, I use them to develop business cases for, you know, we need to spend £100 million on this new piece of mass transit system, but that strategic business case use is still the predominant use of transport models. There is a lot more to go at, I think, around this operational and tactical layer of the transport system and decision making for operators, for service design, which is first nature to the retail business or the banking sector. This is not revolutionary stuff. It's just a bit different for transport, and I think it's something we've all got to embrace.
Thanks, Mike. We're quickly romping through our time, so I think I'm going to open the questions and answers, and actually it's covering a few of the questions that I had already. So I'm just going to, hopefully you should be able to see that question come through now. So it's one from an anonymous, not an autonomous attendee, picking up on Philippe's points earlier about urbanization. And what about the urban sprawl we've recently seen in the US and the resulting increase in the car demand? So as people perhaps move out to live in cheaper places or primarily working from home a few days a week, so is it counterintuitive to drive on reducing car dependencies, perhaps with the need for individual car ownership or just getting around to see other people or get to places? So Philippe, I wonder whether you could give your insights on that one.
Well, so I'm in a unique situation where I grew up in those suburbs in the outskirts of Nashville, Tennessee, but I'm French and live just outside of Paris. So I'll give you my take on that. The first is that even in those suburbs, there is a large number of people who don't have access to the car, and to whom the design of the car-dependent suburb, if you will, closes down their opportunities for access. And those are the very old, those are the very young, and those people who can't operate a vehicle. And so already these suburbs don't necessarily deliver all the services they could for those who could drive a car. So with that in mind, I think having access to a car and having access to a car that you don't have to own or drive yourself might be something that actually increases opportunities for those people. In that model, the car dependence, there's a difference between car ownership dependence and car use dependence. I think there will always be car use dependence in these areas, but the car ownership dependence might be something that moves away, especially if we see some degree of relocalization, like what I described earlier. And I think that is where some of these shared services show great promise, alongside the redesign of some of these suburbs to support that. Finally, in those areas, there is a cohort effect where a number of people have moved out there, have raised children there, are getting old, and they're getting old in place. And as they stop being able to operate cars themselves, they have to have access to a car or some kind of demand responsive transport to get around. And again, that indicates that even in these areas that were designed for the car, you can have some degree of mobility without actually having to operate the car yourself. And so I think that those are some of the changes that we will probably see going forward in terms of the new market opportunities that car-based or van-based sharing services can bring to these areas. A move away from car ownership dependence and a change in the way we use vehicles in these areas.
Thanks, Philippe. And we've got another question here from Azarel tomorrow. So with very context-based exceptions, hopefully you can see that. With very context-based exceptions, normally technology-based solutions yield optimum results once the foundations have been laid out. Reliable public transport, service accessibility, some of the points actually, Tim, that you're touching on earlier. So from this point of view, how can municipalities with limited funding that are pushed to select the kind of technology solutions that fit best to them? So noting that in Japan and China, it's also trying to avoid sort of giving competitive advantages to some of these text-based services. So Tim, I wonder whether you wanted to come in on that one.
Yeah, when I was working for the city of San Francisco as the chief innovation officer, we were bombarded every day with like the best solution for this, that, whatever. And we developed a program where we basically started to turn that around. So we worked internally with all of our departments. We did, instead of doing outreach, we did inreach within all the departments in the city and said, what are your problems? No one wants to admit they have a problem in the government, but they do clearly, because look what we have around us. So we had to acknowledge that here were the specific problems. And then we broke them down to what could be fixed in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or 20 years. Because when you ask the public, what can we do to fix transport? They need 40 subway lines and then they'll be happy. So I said, okay, well, we can't do that. Well, what could we do right now? And we did a lot of crowdsourcing and actually asked the communities themselves, what could we do to improve services right now? One of the things, an idea that came out from a young person who was a transit rider said, why can't we have all-door boarding? Why do we have to all come in from the front, from the very beginning, right? So we did that and we tried that out and actually worked out really well. You know, we had another question asked us like, you know, why do we have to spend all this money for building up all of these transit capacity by buying more trains when there's a parallel bike corridor that could take a lot of those short trips away and allow more capacity on the train for the longer trips. But without having that multimodal perspective and having that community-based outreach process, we couldn't even ask ourselves the right questions. And then once we actually had asked ourselves the right questions and we knew what the problem sets were, we could packet those problem sets for startups, for large corporates, whatever. And so they would actually understand, this is what we need help on. We don't need a solution. We have a problem set and we need you to help us either figure out that problem set or directly help us with a specific solution. And that made the relationship a lot more equal, rather than a salesperson, you know, trying to shove a solution down the government's throat, or the government being too wishy-washy. You know, one department wants this, one department wants that. Now we're clear saying, here are the 10 problem sets that we're willing to achieve in this year. Can you help us? And let's work on that. And the last thing I'll say on this was, it all came down to procurement. Everything collapses under procurement. So we brought the procurement team at the initial set of discussions with the vendors and the hopefuls, so they could hear the frustrations. And they said, you know what, in my power, I can change these things. So, you know, we automated some things, we digitized some stuff, we allowed them to become more pilot driven. And that's when you learn together, but without all the key players understanding up front what the city actually needs or the municipality needs, we're never going to get there. And it's never about money. It's always about policy, frameworks, governance, rules, and that sort of stuff. The money always follows.
Thanks, Tim. And I was going to try and squeeze one in just before we finish, which I'll direct to Mike, and it kind of leads on from that question. So from another anonymous attendee is about, in light of the discussion about the right platform, the subsidies and taxes used effectively by the operators to stimulate the right transportation services. So I guess that's something you can't steer directly within Transport for the West Midlands, but perhaps you have a view on some of the initiatives maybe the UK government is taking in this area. Another broad and
no pressure.
Oh, I think we've lost you, Mike.
So it's going to be an area that I think is going to be well scrutinised and changed over the next few years, to be honest. Partly as a function of the aggressive move towards EV powertrain, at least in the UK, having quite an impact on the national exchequer in terms of tax revenue. There's some open discussions around road user charging, potentially being an option to fill that in, which goes straight back to Tim's point about driving an equity of cost base and pricing into transport choices, which doesn't currently exist. That in turn will address some of the public transport operators' own choices around kind of commercial internal cross subsidy, and I think combine that with the disruption to all commercial models of mass transit networks, where some of the affordability for the next couple of years has to be questioned because of some of our best case scenario is several percentage down as a very best case scenario in a post-COVID recovery for public transport. That's going to require those operators to find different models of working with each other and within their own internal markets. Perhaps less protectionism and more collaboration. Quite what role local and national policy plays in that, I think we're just gonna. I'm not going to make policy on the hoof. We'll watch that one play out with interest.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and unfortunately we've hit time, though I'd love to continue the discussion. So all that's left for me to do is to thank Philippe, Tim and Mike for joining us today. It's been a really good discussion. Please connect with us to continue the conversation. I'm very happy to do follow-ups as well if there's specific questions that you've got. So thank you all for dialing in. We'll make this recording available hopefully in the next 24 hours or so to those who dialed in. And we hope to join you soon on the next Immense session. So thank you very much and have a good evening or a good late morning if you're in the US. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.